Democratic Party is experiencing an immense hollowing out, an immense downfall due to several factors. It has some of the lowest favorability ratings that it's had in a very long time. There is currently an internal rift within the structure of the party about ideology and temperament moving forward. And of course, there are a lot of reassessments on how they can prevent further political losses after their massive defeat in the 2024 presidential election. But a lot of observers that are trying to assign the reason for this downfall, for this hollowing out, are missing the point, and they are refusing to evaluate this particular event, this series of events rather, within the context of the broader history of not just the Democratic Party, but also philosophical progressivism. So in this video, as we are wont to do on this channel, we're going to actually take a look at this from a much broader lens, and we're going to explore just why the Democratic Party has fallen in such a state of ill repute, and we're going to sort of analyze the currents within the progressivism that might give us a good picture on where this will go in the future. But before we get into that, my friends, hope all of you are doing well. I'm Christian Watts. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that our channel is successful. Again, we are a budding operation, and I believe that we have a message that is very powerful, that is not only succinct, but it's also substantive, and that amid the sort of wiles of modern discourse that are just drenched in sensationalism, we have a solution to that. And so if this sounds like an interest to you, and if you are an American or not an American, but you just love Western civilization and you love the philosophies that underpin it, then I would encourage you again to contribute to this channel if you can. Like, share, comment, subscribe. Thank you guys so much. Now, please enjoy the video. So, as I mentioned, the Democratic Party is not having a very good time at the moment. There have been numerous internal debates, struggles, and rifts ever since the 2024 election. There has been a notorious lack of talent, so to speak, because normally after an election, and regardless of which side wins, the parties try to figure out which talents will lead them into the future. They try to pin their destinies to personality, which, by the way, is one of the many problems that they are having this issue in the first place, which we'll address in a second. And also, there is a question about why. They're trying to diagnose exactly why they lost. And so, in order to really understand the scope of this, though, we have to see just how devastating their loss was. The Democratic Party and progressivism in general has historically gone to political power on the coattails of minorities. And in 2024, several minority constituencies of the Democratic Party actually lost significant favor for them and went over to the GOP, such as Native Americans, Asians, and Black people aged 18 to 54 experienced massive shifts, massive rightward shifts, so on and so forth. And so some of the prognosis for this kind of state of ill repute, as I mentioned before, are as follows. Some people are arguing that the Democrats are simply destructive in their ideology and they can't create anything, and therefore, since they can't create anything and they're destructive, they can't articulate a positive agenda. Others, a corollary of this argument is that the Democrats are constantly on the attack against conservatism and against political figures like Donald Trump, for example, in the example of Cory Booker, who did a very long marathon speech primarily about Donald Trump and not very much about ideas and substantive ways forward. They are so pigeonholed to that they really can't move forward. There's a lot of different prognoses, but these prognoses actually are looking at things through a one-dimensional lens, because the Democratic Party is not merely a political machine. The Democratic Party is an incubator. It's a vehicle for the broader ideological movement of progressivism. And so, if the Democratic Party is failing, that means on an electoral level, progressivism as a movement is also suffering as well. So in order to understand the current condition of the Democratic Party, we have to understand the current condition of progressivism, and we also have to understand how progressivism rose to power in the first place, and the characteristics it bore as it rose to power. I can already hear the critics say that, Christian, the Democrats are constantly scorned by progressives as being non-sufficiently progressive and too establishmentarian, therefore your analysis is flawed. Well, as I mentioned, vehicles are not always perfect. Sometimes they are quite imperfect. Sometimes they have cracks in the windows, or the wheel system don't quite work as you want them to, or the engine needs a tune-up. But a vehicle whose identity is shaped around transporting something is still going to be intimately connected with that thing. A car and its owner are two peas in a pod, so to speak. So this is still a relevant conversation to have, even if some in the progressive movement might think that the Democratic Party does not sufficiently fulfill their needs. It is still their major vehicle into electoral viability. And so my reason, in my opinion, why the biggest reason why the Democratic Party is having trouble is because it, and more generally the progressive movement, has lost its populist touch. Today's progressive movement actually lacks populism. Populism brought it to favor in the first place, and its lack of populism has actually caused it to retrograde. And so essentially, we have to look back through history to see what I'm talking about here. So when progressivism first arose in the beginning of the 20th century, it was primarily about revolting and sort of encouraging a mass revolt of the people against the perceived ills of the day. Whether in their view it was the inequality between women and men, whether in their view it was the problem of child labor, or whether in their view it was the greediness of the sort of capitalist class, so to speak. This was the main driving force of the progressive movement back then. And an undercurrent of this movement was this sort of single-minded focus on what a lot of people who led this movement called the plutocratic class. The plutocrats are simply people that are very wealthy. And so progressivism and its sort of populist bent was built upon this conflict, this dichotomy between the wealthy plutocrats, as they would call it, and the masses, the common good, so to speak. This was the single dichotomy that progressivism was built upon. And there are many different figures that articulated this very dichotomy. For example, James B. Weaver, who was not necessarily a Democrat at first, although he eventually became one later in his life. He was a major progressive voice whose ideas influenced how the Democratic Party back in the early 1900s actually worked. And he mentioned, for example, that if progressivism was done right, it would bring forth what he called a golden age of popular power. And I quote him when he says, in this golden age of popular power, we would have an unshaken faith in the integrity and final triumph of the people. But their march to power would not be unobstructed. The universal uprising of the industrial forces will result in unifying the monopolistic and plutocratic elements. And through the business of social influences of these potential awakened forces, thousands of well-meaning professional and businessmen of all classes will be induced for a time to make common cause against us. So for Weaver, again, there's this conflict. The people versus those who are in the industrial class. The people versus those who are wealthy. The people versus those who are already called plutocratic. Basically, the people, the consumers versus the producers. Now, this is a sort of, many of you may be recognizing this from history. This is a sort of corollary to Marxism, but not entirely. Because progressivism is a few steps below Marxism, because progressives don't necessarily embrace the whole sort of dialectical materialism where Marxists believe that history moves in one direction as fixed by these determinist laws. Progressives don't quite believe that. But they do embrace the class conflict theory. Now, this is not just unique to Mr. Weaver. This is also common in other progressive era populists like William Jennings Bryan, who made the famous Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic National Convention back in his day, where he said, having behind us the producing masses of this nation, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer the demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns, you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. The context here is that back in these days, there was a subset of very wise people that understood that currency backed by full faith and credit, currency backed by abstract niceties, as opposed to being backed by hard physical reality, is ultimately an unstable basis upon which to stake a nation's economy, and therefore they supported the gold standard. Bryan thought this was bad because he thought that it's sort of having a wide circulation of money would actually benefit the consumers, benefit the working classes, and disadvantage the industrial classes, and therefore it was a good thing. You also see this kind of populist message manifest in the conflict between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. So Theodore Roosevelt had this new nationalism plan where he thought in order to rein in the industrial classes, the plutocratic classes, you had to have the government supervise them and regulate them on a formal basis. Well, Woodrow Wilson had a more market-oriented approach, but it was still authoritarian, and that Wilson believed instead of having the government have this union with these big businesses, which could cause, in his opinion, even more of a perverse union to be created, he thought, why don't you just break up the businesses and then regulate them so heavily that their power in society is reduced? Again, both of these were staked upon the idea that going against business will ultimately help the common man. Huey Long, who came after both Wilson and Roosevelt, had these massive share your wealth clubs. The governor of Louisiana, where around the nation, all these Americans came along and they argued for the redistribution of wealth in their communities on a mass scale. Millions of people. This guy and his plans were so popular that they were once supposed to have, they were supposed to eventually have made him win the presidency because he was going to run for the Democratic primary, but he got shot and killed, and so he wasn't able to do that. And FDR, of course, was the one who won there. Under FDR's term, you also saw this kind of populism as well with the whole rationing during the World War II, where he had this propaganda post out saying, if you're riding alone, you're riding with Hitler, signifying that if you decide to drive by yourself and not share the car with anybody, in other words, if you govern your life according to your own needs and your own standards, not according to the standards of the government, you're somehow aligned with the evil, distant, dictatorial class as opposed to the plutocratic class. All of these things, my friends, all these different strands are what ignited the furor for progressivism within America, and what has ushered in over 120 plus years of progressive rule in this country. It was a kind of populism bound up with class conflict, bound up with envy, bound up with resentment, and bound up with a narrow-minded view of man within society, viewing him as a creature of his possessions, as opposed to a creature of his inherent being and his inherent values, his spiritual constitution. This will always be the weakness of progressivism. Now, this dichotomy, however, became even worse for the progressive movement when it shifted over towards the sort of new left, the sort of left that went away from focusing on the economic issues, to focusing on issues of identity and on issues of race and issues of sexuality. And this left, which was birthed in the late 60s, early 70s, were essentially the parents of the left that we see today, that is so-called branded the woke left, the current left that has taken over the Democratic Party in many ways and has made their political operations so unfeasible to people. And so one of the reasons why I think that we're seeing this problem with the Democratic Party is not just because progressivism has lost populist edge these days, but because progressivism has inherently been the governing ideology for, again, 120 plus years across social landscape, so much so that it's lost its touch with the sort of the issues of the people, and it's instead become a kind of ideology of the elite. Now, let me just say this very clearly. I don't believe that populist appeals generally are sound if they are based on mass approval as opposed to being based on first principles. Therefore, when someone says the word elite or they say the word common good or whatever, I see both of those terms as nonsensical insofar as they don't actually describe anything substantive. They simply describe signifiers that some people use to understand society, but they are very low quality ways of understanding society. But to the extent that those signifiers are actually valid, they do describe something that's actually happening. And so the Democratic Party, and by way of progressivism, has given way to its other elements, its more elitist elements. Because progressivism, on its offset, one of its major accomplishments in American society was the creation of the administrative state. And the entire premise of the administrative state is that those who are in the know, those who are experts, inherently have the wisdom to regulate the affairs of society towards moral ends, to protect the common good, as they would call it, to protect the common people, so on and so forth. And so progressivism went from populism and gave way to a cult of experience that is manifested in the form of all these different departments, that is manifested in the form of regulatory state that is separate from the accountable structure of our classic Republican system, and has again given an entire new class of people lawmaking power who do not legitimately own it. And when this is, again, your backdrop, when this is the source of your appeal, then your ability to speak to issues that a lot of people care about is going to be drastically limited. So progressives went from being populist in their own twisted version of the phrase to being sort of having this cult of experience that they uplift and that they praise, and their arguments and their considerations became centered around that. And this cult of experience, however, its character shapeshifted, so to speak, shapeshifted rather, to meet the sort of identity of this new left, of this identity left that has alienated so many people. A lot of Americans have become very distasted with the cult of experience, especially after the wake of COVID. A lot of Americans are kind of channeling the inherent ethos of their civilization, realizing that no matter the credentials you have, credentialism is not wisdom. Credentialism is not an assurer of moral truth. Credentialism is not an assurer of correctness, either moral correctness or conceptual correctness. Credentialism, rather, is simply a cudgel that is oftentimes used by those in authority to not just keep authority, but to regulate it according to their biases by giving it some kind of hallmark of legitimacy, wholly and artificially crafted by institutions that, again, seek to still maintain their hold over their subject areas. And so, after COVID and after so many things that have happened where the wisdom, or the unwisdom rather, of these so-called experts has been proved so dutifully to the people, that production of progressivism has become a mark against it. You couple that with the new left sort of opposite of the class conflict, the more gender, sexuality, and identity conflict ideology that has also made a lot of people upset, and you get a recipe for disaster. You get a bunch of people who awaken to a new kind of way of seeing themselves and seeing their own life. You get a class of people who understand the merits of the notion of personal responsibility and freedom. Because without freedom, you don't have personal responsibility. And understand that in order to have those things, you must have a kind of autonomy over your lives that progressivism inherently denies people. They understand so many different things. They understand that the class-based view of seeing things is not a logical view of seeing things, and it's not a right view of seeing things either. They understand. They begin to see society as a matter of shades of color, as opposed to simply seeing it as a black or white. That is what is ultimately occurring right now in American society, and that is why I think the Democratic Party is having such a problem. Not just because the Democratic Party has made some bad electoral decisions, right? Not just because the Democratic Party has politically miscalculated. No, it's because progressivism and the Democratic Party are intrinsically linked, and the bluffs of progressivism, that the expert is inherently the wise man, and that experience is inherently an assurer of virtue, and also that you can see society as a matter of classes, and you can judge man based on his possessions and not on the basis of his values. These ideas have been heavily contested and refuted, and people are now actively fighting against them. That is why the Democratic Party has such a hard time. And so we should take this moment to reflect not just on the mighty downfall of the Democratic Party and its attempt to try to reconstitute its image, so to speak, to fit modern political sensibilities, but we should also take time to reflect on the fact that whenever a movement becomes a part of the status quo, it is very hard for them to rebuff criticisms of the status quo, because they would be in effect negating themselves. Whenever a movement supposes that you can understand politics on the basis of structure and not on the basis of values and eternal principles, which was one of the many suppositions of the progressive movement, then you should also understand that when those values and eternal principles outlive outdated structures, that movement will ultimately also fall down. We are seeing, my friends, an awakening that has little to do with political strategy and everything to do with a rediscovery of civilizational identity, everything to do with a reawakening of national pride, everything to do with a sort of a desire, a thirst for a deeper connection with American civilizational history. This is not, of course, a perfect event that is happening. There are many aspects of this, my friends, that are not necessarily going well. There's still a lot of education that needs to happen, especially amongst youngsters. There's still a lot of different things that need to happen for this awakening to completely complete itself. But in an era where people are fiercely reasserting patriotism, against this sort of European ideas that have managed to take over American systems under the progressive movement. It is an era where a kind of Democratic Party of the past that we've known for so many years is not only impractical, it is frankly an insult to the good sense of any American who cares about his country. So this hollowing out will continue, I believe, until the Democratic Party understands one simple thing. If you wish to succeed in America as any political entity, you can only go against its core ethos for so long. But when people get tired, as Machiavelli said, Machiavelli was very clear, you cannot conquer a free people. If you're going to conquer them, you have to destroy them because they will remember their liberty and they will remember what that brought forth. If the Democratic Party is going to survive, it's going to need again to go back to some of the general principles that some of its earlier people professed, principles like equality and justice, and explain to the American people why their version of those things is not only beneficial for our country, but is respectful of our founding generation's vision. But given that progressivism itself is a revolt against the founding generation, I think that they're going to have a very hard time doing that. And if my supposition is correct, that means that progressivism and the Democratic Party are actually on the way out in American society. And that is a very, very welcomed event that all of us should celebrate. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, contribute, donate if you can. My friends, here's all links that you can support me at. Study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.